Hostage, a Todd Mills mystery, book 3 in the series. Arthur R.D. Zimmerman, publisher, Scribble Pub. Narrator, Eric Ost. Chapter 10. All Rawlins wanted was to get on that plane and go to New York. Maybe he was reading too much into it. Maybe a long weekend in Manhattan wasn't that big of a deal for Todd. Perhaps a mere lark, but Rawlins couldn't help looking at the trip as a signal. A sign that this was it, the big relationship of his life. He'd had his disco days, he'd had his fuckathon, dating one guy after another, but all he wanted now was one simple but seemingly impossible thing. Someone to love him who loved him too, and he prayed to God that Todd Mills was that guy at last. So he just had to get well, and he had to do it fast. But dear God, his sinuses were killing him. If anything, the pain was getting worse, and now driving to his doctor's and gingerly touching his forehead, he had the sensation of walnuts being stuffed up his nasal cavity. Oh, this time he was going to get down on his knees and beg his doctor for the strongest possible medication. The drugs he'd been taking, a decongestant and an antibiotic, weren't even touching the pain. True, you couldn't be gay these days and not be a hypochondriac. But Rawlins kept telling himself he had a good doctor and that they'd get to the bottom of it. Last week, he'd had a thorough physical, and if nothing showed up in all those tests, then he'd go see an allergist. After all, it could be something like dust mites, or it very well could be girlfriend. Rawlins had never had an allergic reaction to cats before, but then he'd never lived with one, and he'd been all but living full-time at Todd's for the last month. And thank God for that. Kurt's death wasn't something he was going to get over, not ever. Of that he was sure. Rather, Rawlins already understood that Kurt's death was destined to become a marker in his own life, a before and after kind of thing, for watching the course of Kurt's illness had altered something quite fundamental in Rawlins. Quite simply, he'd never seen anything as awful as what Kurt had endured. First, Kurt's asshole of a lover of 5 years had jumped him, just walked out the door and never came back. The very day Kurt had discovered both that he was HIV positive and that his condition had already progressed into AIDS. Next, there was the endless assault of infections, the parade of doctors, and then Rawlins had witnessed how Kurt had so quickly fallen apart, as if he were running from the grave. Rawlins had seen AIDS before, of course, but until Kurt, much of it had been at arm's length. This was Minneapolis and St. Paul, and after all, this was flyover land, about as safe from AIDS as any gay man could be. Thank God the epidemic hadn't hit as it had in New York and San Francisco, where Rawlins had heard of guys going to their 100th AIDS funeral, of apartment buildings emptied of all the men, and of telephone lists rendered useless because all the numbers belonged to dead men. For Rawlins, Kurt's death had simply proved to be the proverbial straw. While he knew of death after death of Twin Cities men, Kurt's was amazingly the first AIDS death he'd been involved with on a near daily basis. Was it because so many others had retreated to die at family homes and farms up north, or in the Dakotas or Iowa? Or was it because Rawlins was a self-centered faggot who'd been too afraid to give his time to any of the charity groups? Both, undoubtedly, regardless, until Kurt, he'd never seen anything so awful, so up close. How AIDS didn't just attack one part of the body, but every part. The lungs, the skin, the mind, the inside of the mouth, even the fingernails. For Kurt, however, Rawlins had been there, changing his diaper and spoon-feeding him broth and laughing and crying. Jesus Christ! He kept screaming inside. Why couldn't Kurt have hung on just a bit longer? Why couldn't he have gotten any of the new drugs soon enough to make a difference? Rawlins nearly went insane watching Kurt slip away, and he wouldn't have made it if Todd hadn't been there. God, thought Rawlins as he drove through the sunny day toward Park and 26th. Todd Mills was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and there was no way Rawlins wasn't going to New York. The last thing he wanted was to give Todd some reason to back off, for it was only in the last month or two that they had crossed some sort of line. Or, rather, Todd had crossed it, for Rawlins had been there, waiting, hoping. Shit, he was so in love with Todd Mills, and What he loved most about him was something he couldn't identify, something he'd never felt with anyone before. Simply, when they were together, nothing else seemed to matter. And that was when Rawlins knew this was right, that there was a God or a higher power or whatever. You just didn't get the chance to feel that way about someone else, male or female, without an almighty blessing you. So, as Rawlins parked his car and turned off the engine, he was determined to buck the pain and infection tormenting his sinuses. There was no other choice. I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be okay. And I'm going to New York, he chanted as he got out, zipped up his leather coat, and started toward the short brick building housing his doctor's office. He pulled open the glass door and entered a waiting elevator car. Boy, wouldn't he like to have his blood pressure taken right now. Must be way up there. And then the lift started, carrying him to the top. When he reached the third floor and stepped out, however, he was immediately dizzy. That was what was really driving him crazy, his sense of balance, for his blocked sinuses had caused fluid to build up in his inner ear. He took a deep breath, steadied himself. Just give me a drug that works, he prayed. The pressurized cabin of an airplane really would be torture. Entering the first door, he went right up to the receptionist's desk and said, "Hi, I'm Steve Rawlins, and I have an appointment with Dr. Samuelson." "Certainly, Mr. Rawlins," said the woman, checking the calendar. "It'll just be a few minutes. Just have a seat, and the nurse will call you." It was stupid, but he searched her face, late 50s, finely wrinkled skin, plain features, light blue glasses, light blue sweater. Serious. He thought of all the tests he'd had last week, but there wasn't a trace that she knew any of the results. Then again, why should she? He sat down, glanced around. An elderly woman sat across the room in a wheelchair. To his right, a small boy was curled in his mother's lap, and on the other side, a young woman was reading Better Homes and Gardens and sniffling. Rawlins picked up Sports Illustrated, made a weak attempt at thumbing through it, but didn't really see a single word or picture. "Stephen Rawlins." His heart jolted, and he looked over. A nurse in a white uniform stood in a doorway, looking at his chart. Feeling suddenly nervous, he slowly stood up, then didn't move for a second. Surprised at his feebleness, he looked at the nurse. She smiled back, with his heart ticking faster and faster, and his armpits blossoming with anxious perspiration. He followed the nurse from the waiting room, down one narrow hall, down another, and to a small room for patients. "Dear God," prayed Rawlins, "please let there be a simple explanation. Why I can't rid the infection from my head. Please let everything be all right. I've got to go to New York next week, because I've just found the most wonderful person. Please don't let me lose him." "Just have a seat," she said with a smile as she ushered Rawlins into the room. "The doctor will be right with you." Rawlins was too nervous to make a peep, and he went in and sat down on a molded plastic chair. As the nurse shut the door and disappeared, Rawlins wanted to jump up, beg her not to leave. "Aren't you supposed to take my blood pressure? How long will I have to wait to see the doctor? Oh, and why are my sinuses killing me?" Rawlins closed his eyes and touched his forehead, surprised at the panic suddenly surging through him. There was a gentle knock on the door, and the doctor entered. A short man with a graying beard, balding head, glasses. "Hello, Steve," he said, extending his hand. "Ah, shit," thought Rawlins as they shook hands. "Why does he look so serious?" "Hi." Dr. Samuelson sat down opposite Rawlins, opened Rawlins' chart. There was a moment of silence that seemed to last forever. All of the tests they'd done flashed through Rawlins' mind, but of course there was only one that mattered. The very test that he'd blocked out all week. The very one that was now making him so incredibly nervous. And he blurted out, "Are my test results in? The one for HIV?" "Yes," said the doctor, who took a deep breath and looked right at Rawlins, his face as grave as an executioner's. "Yes, the results are back, and Steve, I'm afraid I have some very unfortunate news." "It's me again, the guy who offed Kurt. And today I want to get up on a soapbox and scream. I want to scream because I hate street people. I mean, look at this letter that the Florida AIDS ride received from a Florida state official. In my capacity outside the office, I again have no interest in your AIDS bicycle ride. It is my personal belief that AIDS as a disease was created as punishment to the gay and lesbian communities across the world. Unfortunately, due to their lifestyles, many innocent people have also had to suffer. For those people, I am truly sorry, and I hope that one day we can cure this disease. As far as the gay and lesbians of this world, let them suffer their consequences. Now, that's exactly what I can't stand about AIDS in America. The rationalization that you're a homo and you're doomed to get these cooties. How can people be so warped? First of all, duh, no one deserves anything like this. Second of all, wow, there are 30 million people on this planet who've been infected with HIV, something like 6.4 million of whom have already croaked of AIDS. And do you think most of them are homos? Hell no. For the info of straight white Americans who can't see beyond their own priggish noses, worldwide only 5% to 10% of HIV infections have been transmitted via homosexual contact. Shocking, huh? Just think of it. Every minute of every day, 6 people are infected. That's 8,500 new cases a day, 1,000 of which are kids, and almost all of them straight. I curse the conservatives in America. I curse the religious right, for there is a God, but he or she or it certainly isn't theirs. Trust me, this, the most politicized disease in the history of the world, ain't never going to end until those guys in the boxer shorts, the straight white guys on Wall Street and in Washington who run the world, start getting AIDS from banging their secretaries and mistresses. Yup, that's when we'll see some real action, just as soon as they turn HIV positive. End of lecture. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.